Welcome back, deep divers. Today, we're going deep on some pretty bold claims from Jeffrey Sachs, the American economist.
Oh, yeah, Sachs. I know him mostly from his work on sustainable development. What's he saying now?
It's from a recent address he gave to the EU Parliament,
Okay.
and he's definitely not shying away from controversial takes on the global stage.
So what's got him fired up this time?
Well, to kick things off, he really goes after, he calls it U.S. interventionism.
Interventionism.
He's basically saying the U.S. has this long history of meddling in other countries' affairs, often with really unintended and disastrous consequences.
I mean, that's not exactly a new idea, right? Plenty of folks have criticized U.S. foreign policy over the years.
Right, right. But the way Sachs connects it to current events is pretty interesting.
Like what?
Well, for one, he uses the Iraq War as a prime example of this interventionist approach.
Right, the Iraq War, that was...
A mess.
Yeah, and he's bringing this up now because...
Okay. Because he sees a pattern. He even links it to the U.S. involvement in the overthrow of Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych back in 2014.
Okay, so he's drawing a line from Iraq to Ukraine. What's the connection, according to him?
He's arguing that these events, even though they seem, kind of far apart, are actually part of this larger trend of the U.S. trying to assert its dominance on the world stage.
So it's all about power for Sachs.
Well, yeah, and how that power is used. And he even shares this pretty startling anecdote to really drive his point home.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
He claims that General Wesley Clark, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe.
Yeah, no, Clark.
Right. So Sachs claims that Clark was told about plans for 7 U.S. wars in 5 years following 9/11.
7 wars in 5 years. Wow, that's a lot.
And Sachs says this intel came straight from the Pentagon.
Hold on. So he's saying there's a plan within the Pentagon to launch 7 wars after 9/11. That's a huge claim.
It is. It is. And it really raises questions about the underlying motivations behind U.S. foreign policy.
For sure. Is it really about spreading democracy and freedom, or is there something else going on?
Right. And this is where Sachs's argument gets really interesting. He directly links this pattern of U.S. interventionism to the current conflict in Ukraine.
Okay, so how does he make that connection?
He argues that the expansion of NATO, particularly into Eastern Europe, was a major, major source of tension for Russia.
Right. NATO, the military alliance.
Exactly. And when Sachs talks about its expansion, he's talking about the inclusion of countries like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, all former members of the Soviet bloc.
Yeah, I get it. So these countries joining NATO is what angered Russia.
Yeah, for Sachs, this eastward expansion of NATO was like poking the bear.
Joking the bear, yeah, I've heard that analogy before.
It created this sense of encirclement for Russia and contributed to the current escalation of tensions.
So he's saying that NATO expansion was a provocation that Russia couldn't ignore.
Exactly. And he goes even further and suggests that the U.S. was a primary instigator in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia.
Wow, so he's placing a lot of blame on the U.S. here. What evidence does he offer for that?
He points to the events of 2014, when the U.S. supported the protests that led to the overthrow of Yanukovych.
Yanukovych, the pro-Russian leader.
Yeah, exactly. And Sachs argues that that Russia's main concern wasn't actually invading Europe.
Not invading. So what was it then?
He says it wasn't about expanding their territory, but their primary fear was, and still is, the growing unipolar power of the U.S.
Unipolar. Okay. Break that down for me. What does that mean, and why is it a problem?
He's basically arguing that the U.S. has become too dominant on the world stage.
Too powerful.
Right. And he's saying that this dominance is actually destabilizing. It creates resentment and pushes other countries to form alliances against the U.S.
I see. So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The U.S. tries to maintain its power, but in doing so, it creates more enemies and potential conflicts.
Exactly. Exactly. So Sachs is painting this picture of a world where the U.S. is calling the shots, but not always in a way that promotes peace and stability.
And he sees the conflict in Ukraine as a direct result of U.S. actions, with Europe caught in the crossfire.
Right. And now, here's where it gets really interesting. Sachs claims that former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has had a significant influence on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East for the past 30 years.
Netanyahu. Wow. Okay, so how does he fit into all of this?
Sachs is very clear about what he sees as Netanyahu's agenda. He wants to achieve a single-state solution in Israel, basically eliminating the possibility of a Palestinian state.
He's saying Netanyahu wants to get rid of the idea of a two-state solution altogether.
Yep, that's his claim. He even goes as far as to call Netanyahu a war criminal. who has been indicted by the International Criminal Court.
Okay, that's a pretty strong accusation. It raises a big question about the influence of individuals on global politics, doesn't it? Can one person really shape the course of events on such a large scale?
That's what Sachs seems to think. He argues that Netanyahu has been remarkably successful in pushing his agenda in Washington.
How so? What's his strategy?
He talks about the Israel lobby and how it exerts influence and blocks any attempts at a two-state solution.
Interesting. So it's not just Netanyahu acting alone. He has powerful allies in the U.S. who help him achieve his goals.
Right. Sachs points to the U.S.'s consistent use of its veto power in the UN Security Council to prevent any resolutions that would recognize a Palestinian state.
So he's saying the U.S. is actively blocking any progress towards peace in the region.
That's his argument. He even names the handful of countries that consistently vote against a Palestinian state: the U.S., Israel, and a few tiny island nations.
That's pretty telling, isn't it? It suggests that the U.S. is prioritizing its relationship with Israel over finding a solution that works for everyone.
And it all ties back to Sachs's larger argument about U.S. unipolarity.
Right, the idea that the U.S. has become too dominant and that this dominance is actually a source of instability.
Exactly. He's suggesting that the U.S.'s close relationship with Israel may be clouding its judgment when it comes to the Middle East,
Preventing them from seeing the bigger picture.
Yeah, he seems to believe that the U.S. is too willing to follow Israel's lead, even when it's not in the best interests of the U.S. or the world.
So what's the solution, according to Sachs? What does he think should be done?
Well, he believes that Europe needs to step up and play a more independent role on the global stage.
So he's calling on Europe to challenge the U.S.? That's a pretty tall order.
It is. He's essentially saying, Europe, you have the economic and political power to be a force for peace and cooperation. Don't let the U.S. dictate your future, especially when it comes to your relationship with Russia.
He's urging European leaders to break free from the U.S. and chart their own course.
Right, and he's urging them to take a more nuanced approach to international relations.
One that recognizes the complexities of the situation and avoids falling into these simplistic narratives of good guys and bad guys.
Exactly. He challenges the dominant narrative that portrays Russia as an inherently aggressive power.
Okay, so he's pushing back against the idea that Russia is the villain in all of this.
Yeah, he argues that their actions are often a reaction to perceived threats from the West.
So it's a more complex picture than we're often presented with.
Exactly. And he highlights the potential dangers of Russophobia, particularly in countries like the Baltic states, where there's a history of tension with Russia.
Russophobia meaning?
Like an irrational fear of Russia.
Okay, got it. So he's saying this fear is blinding some countries to the reality of the situation.
Right, and he makes this fascinating point about how domestic policies can actually fuel international tensions.
Like what? What kind of domestic policies?
He points to things like the banning of the Russian language in Estonia.
Estonia, right. They have a sizable Russian-speaking population.
Exactly. And he argues that these kinds of policies only serve to inflame tensions and make it harder to find common ground.
So he's connecting domestic politics to foreign policy in a really interesting way.
It's like he's saying, if you want peace abroad, you need to foster a climate of understanding and respect at home.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about creating a culture of peace, both within a country and between countries.
Right, and this is where Sachs's critique of European leadership really comes into play.
Okay, so what's he saying about Europe's leaders?
He's highly critical of what he sees as Europe's willingness to follow the U.S.'s lead, particularly when it comes to Russia.
So he thinks Europe is being too subservient to the U.S.
Yeah, he believes that Europe needs to assert its independence and pursue its own interests, which he argues are more aligned with peace and cooperation than with confrontation and conflict.
He's calling for a more independent Europe that can stand up to the U.S. and chart its own course.
Exactly. And he's not afraid to name names, calling out specific European leaders for their hawkish stances on Russia and their reluctance to engage in meaningful dialogue.
So who's he calling out specifically?
He's especially critical of the Baltic states.
Okay, the Baltic states, they've been pretty vocal in their opposition to Russia.
Yeah, and he accuses them of inflaming tensions with Russia through their rhetoric and their close alignment with the U.S.
I see. So he sees them as being too closely tied to the U.S. and too quick to demonize Russia.
Right. He even goes as far as to call them out for their Russophobia, suggesting that their fear of Russia is irrational.
So he's saying they're letting their fear dictate their actions rather than looking at the situation objectively.
Exactly. And now this is where Sachs's argument gets really controversial. He brings up the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage, remember?
Oh, yeah, the pipelines that were mysteriously blown up.
Yeah, and he doesn't hold back. He claims to have inside knowledge about how the U.S. was allegedly involved in the sabotage.
Wow, so he's directly accusing the U.S. of being behind the attack.
Yeah, now whether or not he has concrete evidence is debatable, but the mere mention of this incident highlights the deep mistrust that exists between the West and Russia.
It definitely raises some serious questions about the U.S.'s role in the conflict.
Right, and it raises some uncomfortable questions about whether the U.S. is truly committed to peace in the region or if they have their own agenda.
So it all circles back to Sacks's core argument about U.S. unipolarity, the idea that the U.S. has become too dominant on the world stage.
And that this dominance is actually destabilizing. He seems to believe that a more multipolar world, where power is more evenly distributed, would be a safer and more peaceful world.
And he sees Europe as playing a key role in achieving that balance.
Right. He's urging European leaders to take the lead in negotiating with Russia, finding common ground, and building a more cooperative future.
So in Sacks's view, Europe needs to wake up and realize that it's been sleepwalking into a dangerous situation.
By allowing the U.S. to dictate its foreign policy.
He believes that Europe has the power to change course and create a more peaceful world.
But they need to act decisively and independently.
It's a call to action for Europe to step up and be a force for peace and diplomacy in a world that seems to be increasingly teetering on the brink of conflict.
Okay, so we've just scratched the surface of Sacks's argument here, but I think it's already clear that he's offering it a very different perspective on the current state of global affairs.
A perspective that challenges a lot of our assumptions about the U.S., Russia, and the role of Europe in navigating this complex geopolitical landscape.
And it's interesting how Sachs doesn't just criticize, he actually offers solutions specifically for Europe. He urges European leaders to step up, really act like the major economic and political force they are.
He wants them to stop being so influenced by the U.S. when it comes to foreign policy,
Oh,
right? Yeah, he's saying prioritize your own interests for once. It's like he's reminding them, hello, Europe and Russia, natural economic partners. Not to mention they have deep historical and cultural ties.
Right, and he even names names. He calls out the Baltic states for their Russophobia, He suggests they need to dial back the anti-Russia rhetoric.
I thought that was pretty fascinating how he links their domestic policies to international relations. He argues that things like banning the Russian language in Estonia, which, they have a sizable Russian-speaking population there, it just creates unnecessary tension.
It's like he's saying, look, if you want peace abroad, you need to foster a climate of understanding and respect at home.
Right.
Do you think he has a point?
Absolutely. He's highlighting something really crucial about the interconnectedness of domestic and foreign policy. You know what I mean? And it's a broader point about the need for dialogue and diplomacy, even, or maybe especially, with those we see as adversaries.
He also brings up the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage. Remember that? We talked about it earlier.
Mm-hmm.
He offers to kind of spill the tea on how the U.S. was allegedly involved.
Right. And while, we can't know for sure if he has actual evidence, just bringing it up like that, it really highlights the deep mistrust between the West and Russia. Makes you wonder, doesn't it, about the U.S.'s true commitment to peace.
It does. It raises those uncomfortable questions about whether they truly want peace or if they have a completely separate agenda. And it all kind of circles back to Sacks's argument about U.S. unipolarity, that idea that they've become too dominant globally and it's actually making things less stable.
Exactly. He seems to believe a multipolar world where power is more evenly distributed would be a safer and more peaceful world.
And of course, he sees Europe playing a key role in that. He really emphasizes that European leaders should be the ones taking the lead in negotiating with Russia, finding common ground and building a more cooperative future.
He even suggests that the recent news of peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, which, have made some European leaders nervous, he says it's actually a positive sign.
He doesn't buy into the fear, huh?
Nope. He argues that it shows a willingness to move away from conflict towards diplomacy, which ultimately benefits everyone, but especially Europe.
And he makes his point about European stock markets rising on the news of the peace talks. What do you think about that?
I think it's fascinating. Maybe deep down, everyone knows that peace is the better option, Perhaps it's a sign that people are recognizing those economic benefits of stability and cooperation.
Right. Sometimes the most rational choices are the ones that are good for business. And Sachs clearly believes that peace is good business, both for Europe and for the world.
Oh, absolutely. And after all that focus on Europe and Russia, Sachs circles back to the Middle East. He returns to his claim that Netanyahu has been essentially running U.S. foreign policy in the region for the past 30 years.
And he goes into more detail about how the Israel lobby, as he calls it, exerts its influence in Washington. He even suggests that this influence is actually bad for the peace process.
And he doesn't hold back, does he? Calling Netanyahu a war criminal and really hammering home his belief that a two-state solution is the only way to achieve lasting peace.
He places the blame for the lack of progress squarely on the U.S., arguing that their veto power in the UN Security Council is the only thing stopping a Palestinian state.
He names that handful of countries again, right? The ones that always vote against a Palestinian state.
Well,
The U.S., Israel, and a few tiny island nations, that's it. He's calling on Europe to put pressure on the U.S. to change their stance.
it's a pretty bold call to action. It highlights just how much Sachs believes that the U.S. needs to rethink its approach to the Middle East.
Yeah, and he doesn't let the U.S. off the hook when it comes to Iran either.
Yeah.
He suggests that Netanyahu is pushing for war between the U.S. and Iran, and that the U.S. is a little too easily influenced by those hawkish voices.
He's arguing that the U.S. lacks an independent foreign policy in the Middle East, and he sees that as a recipe for, for escalation and conflict.
But then he throws in this glimmer of hope. He suggests that maybe, just maybe, Trump will break free from this pattern and assert his own vision for U.S. foreign policy. What do you make of that?
I don't know, it's an interesting theory for sure,
Yeah.
especially given how unpredictable Trump is and his tendency to kind of buck conventional wisdom.
It seems like he believes that Trump is more pragmatic than ideological, and that he might be willing to defy the Israel lobby if it means getting a deal that benefits the U.S.
Yeah, it definitely adds another layer of complexity to Sachs's already intricate analysis of global power dynamics. It makes you think, what would a Trump return mean for these delicate situations? Would he really be the one to bring peace to the Middle East, like Sachs suggests?
Or is that just wishful thinking? I guess we'll have to wait and see. But in the meantime, Sachs's insights definitely give us plenty to think about as we try to make sense of this crazy world.
And he kind of wraps things up by talking about China. He suggests that, that the U.S. sees China's economic growth as a threat.
Oh, so he brings China into the mix, too.
Yeah. And he's really critical of how the U.S. has been responding to China's rise.
Yeah.
He argues that China isn't an enemy, really. They're just another success story.
He's saying the U.S. is overreacting to China's success, right? Like, they're seeing competition where there doesn't need to be.
Exactly. He even suggests that, the whole trade war thing, that was just the U.S. trying to hold China back.
It's like he's saying the U.S. can't handle seeing another country succeed, especially if that success might threaten their own economic dominance.
Right. Like they automatically view any rising power as an enemy. It's a pretty bleak outlook,
Yeah, it is. But it's important to hear these different perspectives, right? I mean, Sachs is definitely not afraid to point fingers, but sometimes you need someone to, shake things up a bit, Challenge those assumptions we all have.
Absolutely. So let's take a step back for a second, try to synthesize all this. What were the biggest takeaways for you from this deep dive into Sachs's perspective?
Well, for me, it's how much he emphasizes the dangers of U.S. unipolarity. He makes a really compelling case that this concentration of power, it's led to a lot of instability and conflict around the world.
Right. It's not just about who has the biggest military or the strongest economy. It's about how that power is used and the impact it has globally.
Yeah, exactly. And his call for Europe to step up, play a more independent role on the global stage, that really resonated with me.
Me too. It's like he's saying, Europe, you have so much potential to be a force for good. Don't let the U.S. dictate your future.
And he really pushes us to reconsider those assumptions we have about countries like China and Russia. Are they really the enemies we've made them out to be? Or are they just, pursuing their own interests like everyone else?
In a world where things are constantly changing, that's a good question to ask for sure.
Yeah.
So before we wrap up, I have to ask, if Sachs is right about all this, about all these global power dynamics, where do we go from here? What does it mean for the future?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Sachs seems to believe that a multipolar world with power distributed more evenly, that's the key to a peaceful and stable future. The question is, how do we even get there?
Is it even possible to shift the balance of power that much? And, what role do we as individuals even play in shaping a more peaceful future?
He seems to think that Europe could be the key. If they can really assert their independence from the U.S., forge their own path, maybe it could trigger a domino effect, lead to a more balanced world. It's a bold idea, and probably not easy to achieve.
It's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
So for all of our deep divers out there, here's a final thought to consider. If Sachs is right, what role will you play in shaping this new world order? Will you just be an observer? Or will you be an active participant in the fight for a more just and peaceful future? The choice is yours.
And on that note, that's where we'll leave our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us.